Hi everyone. Thanks so much for attending this webinar. My name is Liberty Longalong and I am an application engineer for CAD Technology Center. This webinar is called PSD scripts for different types of renderings, so different rendering types. We will actually go into interior and exterior renderings that can be edited within the software that they were originally 3D modeled in. Sometimes this process involves a little more setup and time. So this webinar will show users when to distinguish making edits in Revit as opposed to photo editing software before and after a rendering is generated. So after the rendered PNG or JPEG files are imported into photo editing software, the settings are configured for this image. So in turn, an end user can export these settings to an automated script file in order to complete the same tasks in a time crunch for multiple renderings. So today's learning objectives include defining differences between interior and exterior renderings, and they are loud and clear. One's outside the building and one is inside the building. So we'll be looking at an exterior rendering and focusing on the exterior elements for editing. We will also be looking at interior renderings, and we will focus on some of the interior modeled elements for editing as well. So the second learning objective includes selecting aspects of your rendering for editing in photo editing software. So for this webinar, we will be selecting and modifying a finalized rendering within Photoshop. We will be using additional lighting settings. I will show you these lighting settings within Revit as well as Photoshop so that you can achieve brighter results within your images. And then the third learning objective includes creating and sharing a script based on the rendering type. So you can actually export specific actions in Photoshop so that you can automate these specific settings that you'd like to apply to your renderings. Okay, so before we begin, you'll just need to ensure you have the most updated version of the year in Revit that you are working in. Currently, we are on 2017.2.3. You can access these screenshots. Let's see. Let's pull up Revit really quick. Underneath the question mark, and then about Autodesk Revit 2017.2. And then we notice here that we've got the build number. So if you haven't updated, try logging into your Autodesk account. Usually your notifications will let you know that you have a Revit 2017 update. Okay, so the first item we will be looking at is the exterior rendering. So in order to successfully create, there are a few items you would need to be mindful of. Materials need to be applied, family types need to be duplicated and renamed for different materials to generate within a rendering. So here in this image that I've got pulled up in the PowerPoint, I don't have my glass materials mapped. I just have two different wall types. So this is a wall type right here. This is a duplicated wall type right here. I have two different materials mapped to those two different wall types. And on top of those two different wall types, I have a third, which is the curtain wall. So this image here displays what the actual glass looks like. I actually applied a blue-green, very transparent material to this actual wall. But it looks great because the light and the ambient occlusion that comes with, the light bouncing off all of the objects, that ambient occlusion is what is responsible for making a photo look very real, because all of your shadows, your light, your index of refraction, all of that information is bouncing off each other, just like in real life. So if you look at your desk, you notice that if you've got paperweight, there's always going to be that shadow. So think of it this way. It's always easier to modify specific items in Revit so that you can have this accurate ambient occlusion, so that you have accurate shadows instead of spending 5 hours creating shadows, for a rendering that didn't turn out. So the final output here, I just want to take a step back though. When I'm in Revit, I'll just go to maybe one of my 3D views. I just wanted to emphasize the fact that, yes, there are 2 different wall types in this model, 3 when you count the curtain wall glass. So, really quickly, when I'm tabbing over to this wall, if I can do it, I'm going to go ahead and select it and hit Edit Type, look at the type properties. So one of the things that you need to do whenever you're mapping your materials, you just got to make sure that you click on Structure. And when we click on Structure, we notice that we have all the layers of our wall families. So our core boundaries are going to be like our plane boundaries in between all materials. Basically, whenever you want to map your material to that wall, you're just going to have to select this masonry brick material. And because this is a link, I'm not able to directly make changes to it, so I'd have to open it separately. But regardless, this is the dialog box where you'd have to access your materials, you'd have to modify. If you needed to change the pattern of how your materials are applied to your geometry, this is where you would go as well. And we can most certainly have a separate webinar just on materials for that purpose as well in the future. So this is how you get your materials applied. Again, everything's going to be grayed out. All of my parameters will not be editable because this is a linked model. Okay, so we went over the different materials as well as mapping them with the duplicated wall types. So, the final output when I created these images, after mapping the materials, I have this larger image. It's dependent on, how are you going to use this image? You probably worked on this 3D model for 15 hours. You needed to check your work, and maybe your marketing coordinator tells you, okay, we need this image in 15 minutes. Well, at least you can create something within Revit. You can change your actual DPI outputs when you go into the rendering tab. You can change your settings if you want your image to be medium, high, best. Whenever I'm in this dialog box, minimum, if I want to check a rendering or if I want to check my work, maybe my conduit that I modeled or my panels or even my lighting fixtures, I always keep it at 150 DPI because if I do 300 or 600, this rendering will probably take 34 hours. And because this is an exterior rendering, we're going to just include the exterior and sun only because we're not concerned with the lighting. And then, basically you would have to render this, and that's how we actually generate the exterior rendering. So the DPI requirements, it's going to be smaller for something that's going to be going on your website. But if, you're going to be using these images in brochures or some sort of visual handout, that's when I suggest rendering at a larger size. So the next item we will go to is the interior rendering. One of the main things I always like to emphasize with creating these interiors is to make sure your camera is set up the way you want it to be set up. So let's see, I can go back into Revit here, and maybe I want to go ahead and create a camera view of this actual room. So let's see here. We'll just go into the View tab, click on camera. So you notice that when I place this camera, it's hovering with my mouse. So maybe I want to approach this rendering so that I am actually in the corner and I am facing the mechanical or electrical equipment in this room. So if you guys are in the discipline for architecture, you may be a little bit disappointed because this isn't, this isn't a pretty little conference room. It's actually a mechanical room. So I'm going to go ahead and configure my camera view. This middle point of that camera, this is my line of sight. So maybe I want to focus on something within this room. So what's really nice about these 3D views is that it generates another view in the project browser. You can modify it according to how you want it to look. If you want it to be wider, and this is where I was talking about, using your image for different functions. So if I wanted to save this out for web, I'd probably have it, cropped a little shorter because, your website template may only allow for this dimension in regards to an image. Or if you knew you were going to be mass producing a ton of brochures, then you could extend the grips of the camera view. One thing I would like to point out, though, is if you deselect your camera view, I know I've got tons of views open. If you deselect it, you can't find it within your floor plan view that you originally placed it in. So you can either get that camera back in a couple of ways. You can actually go to a 3D view in your project browser and click on Show Camera. Or honestly, I think this is probably a little more efficient, but I'll usually have a couple of views open, a floor plan view as well as my 3D view that I created, and I select the confines or constraints of that 3D view box, and then you see in the floor plan view, there's my camera. So one of the things I did want to emphasize that you guys may run into, with your interior renderings. Let me just go ahead and show you a limitation really quick. So this is my actual lighting fixture family. I don't know if it's going to render 100%, but it's asking me to save. But when I go ahead and configure my settings, we'll go ahead and have a sample created right now, and then you guys can see how this is reproduced. I hit render. I have the lowest settings configured. My project is still thinking. We'll get another rendering progress box that will show up here in a little bit. Oh, it's actually on my other screen. 1 second, guys. So 2 things to make note of here. Well, 1, the image is very, very dark. We can barely see anything. And 2, the lights that we had in our ceiling, well, they're not necessarily lighting up and showing up in the rendering. So for this kind of rendering, for this kind of example, it's best to make these changes within Revit. So on top of it being dark, well, we'll worry about that later. But right now, we need to be concerned with some of the geometry that's going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of here and turn on my temporary view properties, because I do have a view template applied to this particular view. And so when I go to my visibility graphics, I just need to make sure all of my equipment is turned on. However, under generic models, we want to turn off the clearances because those clearances have a transparent red glass material applied. It's not necessarily good for the image because of the ambient occlusion, we're going to have a very red image with lots of warm colors. So turning off those clearances with materials applied to them will certainly help in brightening this image. So we also notice, we've eliminated those reflections of those odd lights that we saw, and they were actually these lights here in this view. But in order for me to actually have them work, I'm going to go ahead and tab to that actual light family. If I can tab over to it. Hold on, guys. Okay, so we'll go to edit type once more, and I think you saw me uncheck the box, but the box parameter that I was checking, or the yes/no parameter, was the emit shape visible and rendering. So as long as that parameter is existent in your light fixture, you got to make sure that that yes/no parameter is turned on, so that that reflects in the rest of the lighting types that exist in the rendering. So we'll go ahead and try this again. We notice that when we hit the image, we don't have our lighting groups, so I believe there are about 150 lights in this rendering. It's still going to think about, well, 130. So that means Revit is rendering all 130 lights. So we fixed the two problems. We were able to get the light sources to display, and we were able to remove the unnecessary reflections generated from the clearances that are getting rendered. So I can either do one of two things. I can export this as a JPEG, or I can export it as a PNG. I normally export as both files, because when you're editing a PNG, you have a lot more data to work with. The JPEG actually just exports out between the 100 to 200 kilobyte file sizes. So with these PNGs, they're actually 2,000 KBs, and you have a lot more information to work with when editing. So we're back to the interior rendering. You just got to make sure that, in short, when you've got some fixes to make, if you want your image to be extremely realistic, you want to get it taken care of within Revit, just make sure all of your geometry visibility is handled before you create the rendering. And if you need to remove something, that's when you would actually use the visibility to edit the rendering, instead of going to Photoshop and taking 4 hours to select that geometry and then make some sort of modification to it so it doesn't display. It's easier just to do it with Revit. Another item I do want to emphasize in regards to changing before creating your rendering. So let's see, I want to find another view that potentially has, let's see, maybe we have a particular view where we want to apply materials. So for this example, I'm just going to go ahead and select my water heater. I actually have to go into the family. So in order for me to apply those materials, you just got to make sure that the geometry is selected. And then if there is a material parameter added to the geometry, you can actually map a material similar to how the walls were mapped to the exterior rendering. So right here, I've already gone ahead and I've added and created a metal, a white painted metal to this water heater. I'll click OK. I can load into my project, and I'm kind of hoping that this one will actually turn out. So let's go ahead and pull up some images here. Let me see. So here is an actual image of that rendering. So we notice right here, we've got the default materials applied. We've got a clearance showing. It's kind of inhibiting me from seeing the shininess of the metal of this pump. But when I go to my edited image, and granted these edits were made within Revit, I've turned off my clearances. I've got a white material mapped to my water heater. So these are situations where, you know, you're thinking, okay, do I have time to go back into my, you know, huge Revit file and go to the particular view in my project browser and re-render? Well, sometimes it's a little quicker in Revit, and sometimes it's quicker in photo editing software or Photoshop. So we'll jump to the actual automated part within the images. So yeah, that example with changing materials, that would be another instance. So within Photoshop, if after the image is rendered, you can apply a few customized settings to alter your image. And again, this is at a global level. This is not something where, you know, we would have to, I don't know, edit like the mullions in this rendering. No, it's a global change. So what I did was actually create some scripts for an exterior and an interior rendering. So I'll just show you how this applies. Basically, I've created a few customization settings for this rendering, and I've assigned an actual key to it. My F5 key is going to be my main command. So I'm hitting F5 right now. We notice that A, the picture looks brighter, and B, you know, we're not stuck in this, okay, this image looks a little bit darker phase with this exterior rendering. So the way I created the script, let's see. So this is actually this little button here. This is going to be your action center, and this is going to be where you'll be able to create these automated ATN files. So maybe I can try to start all over. I'll go ahead and delete this layer. So I'll show you how I quickly create this. So for the exterior, maybe I want to name this, or we'll name this brochure size or something, so that we know, hey, this is going to go into our brochures. This script is for brighter images that are going to be printed. And I can set this to be just for exteriors. And again, this goes into assigning an actual key to my action. So whatever steps I use to edit this photo, this command or this action is going to record everything I do. So let's go ahead and try it. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. I'll control everything on this layer, Control C, and then you notice everything is recording here in the actions dialog. So I'll hit Control V. I'll make sure that my image has another overlay over it so that in case I mess up, I can just delete this layer. But the fact of the matter is it's getting automated. I'll go into image adjustments. Maybe I want to change my saturation because it is looking a little dull. This yellow is looking a little dull here. I can bring this up maybe to, I don't know, 16. 50 is a little too much, but when I go down to maybe I can set this at 35. And then, you know, maybe we can adjust the hue, and I just want a little bit. And then, you know, we want to make this brighter. So it looks a little washed out right now, but I'm going to go ahead and hit OK and change my opacity to this image so that it doesn't look so washed out. So I feel like I'm done. I feel like maybe this is all I need to edit with this exterior rendering, so I'll hit stop. So I've gone ahead and created these actions and commands for this image. Let's go ahead and test our script out. So I'm going to delete the layer that I created to create the action. I believe I configured F10 to be my button to start. So I'll go ahead and hit F10, and bam. You know, all of those 15 different actions or commands that you did in Photoshop, you can actually automate it. And then this is where you can actually export these actions, and they export only from Photoshop user to Photoshop user. So, you know, within your team, your BIM team, let's say maybe you want these settings for everyone to use. All you got to do is export the ATN file, put it on a server location, and everyone else can access it. So this is the actual exterior rendering. This is an example of a script. We can move to the interior. So, we went over in Revit how to make sure your lights turn on, how to actually put some light into a rendering for an interior with no windows. So this is after the fact we've configured that. We're thinking, okay, this looks a little bit dull. I'll go ahead and run the pre-created script that I had set up, and then you can see the differences that will apply. So F4 is my key. Bam. So, we notice that, when I'm looking at this image, it's gone through the same process that I did with the exterior rendering. I basically duplicated and then modified the actual hue and saturation of this image. I also modified the exposure so that this looks a little brighter. But, these are global changes to the image as a whole. I personally like the scripts because, I just press a button and, it modifies my photo without me having to go into multiple commands within this program. But it's great because I can actually delete this and start all over. What if I wanted to apply, something else? You can most certainly add it to your action, but I definitely, we like how everything's looking brighter, everything looks cleaner, you can see some of your equipment, and you can actually see the realistic shadows instead of having to Photoshop those shadows into your rendering. So this is a different room. This is actually the image I showed previously. There are the clearances. I have a few multiple examples of the interior renderings. And then this goes into, how we recorded our actions within Photoshop. So let's see. So, I wanted to end with the conclusion and benefits. After watching this webinar, you'll have a better idea and knowledge of when to make edits before a rendering is created. You'll have a better idea of when to make those edits after the rendering has been created. And granted, it does vary from project to project. It's not always going to be the same. So, from project to project, you may have to edit your settings from rendering to rendering. But for the most part, it's easy to automate scripts for exteriors and interiors separately. And another thing with this workflow is that file sizes are no longer limitations. So, if you were working in a central model that's 400,000 kilobytes large and it takes 20 minutes to open, toggling your visibility would not be the best option because that's going to take another 3 to 4 hours, especially if this file is that large. I mean, you're going to have to go into the project browser, select your view, make sure, your view is actually set up correctly and the materials are mapped. So again, there are times when it's just faster to go into photo editing software.